Hi everybody. In this video we'll talk about creating a bit more complex data API scenario. So we have a normal data API that currently exposes categories, orders, order details, and behind it in our code we have the data API controller, pretty straightforward, and we have an orders view model that controls whatever we get out of the orders. Now, one of our customers asked a question, how can I create a relative data API? Meaning that I want to be able to say something like data API, customer ID, /orders. Now, I'll start by saying that ENVWeb is a prototype open source project that was not designed to support every case in the world. And while we are extending it and improving to it, we strongly encourage you both to acquire normal .NET MVC knowledge and to take the source code of ENVWeb and adapt it to your own needs. You can find the source code for ENVWeb in GitHub, github.com/fireflymigration/envweb. The source code of Data API and everything else is here, and you're encouraged to download it, change it, and even contribute changes if you see fit. But since the question came up, we came up with a quick and dirty way of doing that, which I'm going to walk you through it right now. Again, it's not a final solution, it's just what first came to mind, and we'll probably add mod support for it in future versions. But just to get you going right now, if you need this by Thursday, here it is. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to separate our data API into two data APIs. One that is general, which will be called data API, and another one which is more specific, which will be called customer data API. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go back to our code, to our web demo, and in our data API controller, we'll create a secondary data API. We'll call it customer data API. Perfect. Now, every request that comes in from the browser starts with this index page. So we're going to create a new version of it. We'll call it customer index. It doesn't really matter. And it will receive a name, just like the older one. And instead of calling the data API, it will call the customer data API. Now we're going to move the orders view model from the previous data API to the customer's data API. Okay? So we've separated it to create two data APIs. Let's see how this looks in the browser so far. So our normal data API looks like normal. Again, reloading the web server takes a few seconds, but we can see we have categories and orders. But how do we get to our customer data API? If we try to go to customer data API, okay, we won't get anywhere. We'll actually get the default page of our website, okay, which is this nice little Angular thing. How do we fix that? How do we tell .NET or MVC.NET that when someone asks for customer data API to go to our new method? So for that, there's a configuration called route config in upstart folder. This is pure .NET routing configuration. We can see here that a route already exists for data API, and we'll just need to create another route of our own. So let's copy it and call this customer data API. It will be called from the browser customer data API. Okay. The controller is data API. We're going to use the same controller. But the method, the action, instead of being index, it's going to be customer index. Okay, so in our route config, we're going to say here customer index. So let's build this. Great. And let's go back to our browser and refresh the customer data API. Give the web server a few seconds to reload. And we've got our customer API. So we have two APIs entries. One is the normal data API. Okay, and if we'll do a split screen, data API relates to everything that is registered to the data API. And one is the customer data API, okay, that relates to everything that is registered to the customer data API. Perfect. So let's review what we've done so far. In the data API controller, we've added another data API. We have added another method to call our data API, and we have registered the order view model instead of in the data API in the customer data API. And if we view the changes in our route config, okay, we have added another routing using this URL to call our data API controller and call the action of customer index. I strongly encourage you to read more about MVC.NET and routing. We are using the out-of-the-box MVC.NET routing over here. So let's save this. Perfect. Next thing we want to do is we want to get the customer ID information. Okay? So let's go to our orders view model, or route config. Okay? And in our route here, we can see how it's built. We are getting the customer data API, the name, which means the name of the resource we want from the API, and its ID. And we can add whatever we want over here. So we can say, you know what? I want to add here customer ID. Okay? That means that a request will have to have the structure of customer data API, the ID of the customer, the name of the resource that we want, and its ID. Now we've added it here. We also need to add it in our method. So in our data API controller, we'll add another parameter here, customer ID. Let's build this and see what happens. Great. We'll look at our customer data API. Now when we'll refresh it, we will not get any data because we haven't provided the customer ID. Okay, so we are going to the default page. But if I'm going to provide the customer ID by saying ALFKI, voila. We've got an API that matches ALFKI, and we've got an API that matches TOMS. Okay, we've got an API for every customer that we want. Now let's go ahead and use this data in our view model, but first let's review what we've done. So to receive the customer ID parameter to our method, we've added in our method the customer ID parameter, and in our route, okay, we have added the customer ID parameter in the proportional position of the route. Again, this is basic MVC.NET routing, nothing special over here. So adjusted the route. Perfect. Next thing we need to do is we need to take care of that value. We need to use that value in our orders view model. We need the orders view model to be aware of that value. So here I'm going to use a Firefly class called static context. So let's start by saying using Firefly box. And I'm going to add a member here, public static context static of type string, which is going to be current customer ID. Context static means that every request will have a separate value of this parameter. So every request, this can store a value per request, with making it easier to handle. So let's go ahead and save this value over here. We're going to say current customer ID dot value equals to customer ID. Okay, the parameters that we got in. And in our orders view model, I can now say, well, add controllers dot data API. We want to go to that class. We want to go to our current customer ID member. And what we're going to say is orders dot customer ID is equal to the value from current customer ID. Okay? So this is how this value travels from the data API controller to the orders view model. Since it's on the same request, it's going to have the same value. Perfect. Let's go back to our browser. Let's refresh this. You'll give the web server a few seconds to recover. And if we'll now ask to see the orders, okay, we'll only see orders of customer Tom SP. And if we'll change this to ALFKI, we'll only see orders of customer ALFKI. So this is again our first quick and dirty thought on how you can accomplish a multi-dimensional URL request in REST API using the data API. We'll probably create some more structured support for it in the future. But in the meantime, I'll hope you enjoyed this.